Good evening, everyone, and welcome. There's still people coming in, so that's okay. Um, Thank you for coming, sparing the time this evening, and apologies for any inconvenience that we may have caused by having to reschedule at short notice. Um, just to say that this is a Centre for the History of People, Place and Community event from the Institute of Historical Research, and some colleagues from elsewhere, who I'll introduce to you in a moment. My name is Adam Chapman, and I am a lecturer in medieval history at the Centre, and also one of the co-general editors of the Victoria County History, that venerable local history series, um, which has been going for now 125 years, which aims to produce a history of every parish in England. Um, the reason for engaging in a workshop on self-publishing is something we can explore a little bit later, but just suffice to say, this is something that we're aware is a need. There is a need for in academia today, and indeed other circles, and thus we brought together two people who've done a fair bit of self-publishing in their time. Um, Professor Ann Parry Owen of the University of Wales, Centre for the History, Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies, and Dr. Daniel Reid of the Centre for History of Methodism and Church History, soon to be no more, alas, at Oxford Brookes University. And they'll be introducing us into their experience of self-publishing in an academic context over the next hopefully about an hour, I think. So Anne will go first and give us a presentation on her project, and Daniel will follow, and there'll be time for questions and discussion after that. Please note that my colleague Ruth Satter is also here, and Ruth is my fellow co-general editor of the Victoria County History and lecturer and knowledge exchange manager of the Institute, and also lecturer in. Oh, bother, sorry, Ruth, I've forgotten your job title.
Historic environment.
Historic environment. I wanted to say architectural editor, and of course you are, but that's not your job title. Anyway, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Ann Parry Owen, of the, as I've said, of the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies at the University of Wales, based in Aberystwyth. And Anne has been, among many, many other things, someone who's been putting together the Baether project over the last, I think it's nearly 20 years, which is how I came across her work through my other life as a Welsh historian. So Anne will be introducing us to that project and other projects that come out of the centre over the years, which have been published in-house or self-published in one particular way, which she's now going to introduce us to. And over to you, Anne. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. I'll share my screen and hope this works. Let me take this to the top. Can you all see that? Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation to talk to you about our experiences of self-publishing at our centre in Aberystwyth. I just want to begin by making completely clear that I have no particular technical expertise, so I hope I'm not here under false pretenses. I am, first and foremost, a researcher, and my expertise, if any, lies in medieval Welsh poetry, its interpretation and editing, in medieval Welsh language and grammar, and historical lexicography. Anything that takes me away from my core research has to truly deserve the time I give it. Our end goal as researchers is, of course, to contribute effectively to the scholarship of our field. In other words, to make an impact and to make our mark. The traditional and most effective way to do that is by sharing our research findings with peers through academic publications. So I decided fairly early on in my career that time used to ensure the high quality of publications for which I was responsible at the centre and their swift appearance in print was time well spent. While taking control of the production of the Baether series, the Poetry Nobility series in English, including the typesetting and arranging the printing, meant that I could manage the flow of our publications, making sure that we produced on average between 2 to 3 volumes per year. This consistency of production appealed greatly not just to our employers, the University of Wales, but also to our external funders, the HRB and later the AHRC and others, who provided us with successive grants, partly due to our effective delivery. This steady and consistent flow of publications was also of great advantage to the team members, freeing them up to undertake fresh research for their next publication, rather than having to spend time checking proofs of a volume they may have finished a year or more before that. But as well as saving time, there were and still are other advantages to taking some control over the production process. An academic press will quite often have editorial guidelines to which one may be required to adhere. And even though most of those will be based on common sense and follow the Oxford Style Manual or similar, there will often be some elements of requirements that just don't suit your publication. The University of Wales Press, for instance, favours endnotes rather than footnotes, and this was one of a number of factors that led me to produce in-house at a very economic cost a multi-authored 500-page hardback volume of articles associated with our Gyda Glyn project a few years back, to which Adam Chapman kindly contributed a fantastic chapter. So what I plan to do tonight is to briefly explain about some of the considerations that led us to publish material in-house in the centre over the years, and some of the issues that we've faced along the way. Of course, there have been some huge technological advances since the early 90s when I first embarked on this venture. Yes, I am old. And not only are there now dedicated typesetting programs, as opposed to word processing programs, which can handle the most challenging texts, but it is also now possible for anyone to self-publish at a fairly low cost through one of the many print-on-demand outlets. However, despite these technological advancements, the important issues and considerations for us regarding self-publishing academic work have hardly changed. High standard and peer-reviewed content is crucial, as well as the professionality of the final publication as regards format, layout, and actual feel of the book. But to start with, I need to give you some background. The Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth is a dedicated research centre, which was established almost 40 years ago under the auspices of the University of Wales, under the directorship of Professor R. Geraint Griffith. It was the first research centre of its type in the humanities in Wales and was modelled on Dublin's DIAS, or the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies. As a PhD student approaching the end of my second year of studies at Aberystwyth University, I was fortunate to be appointed a research fellow on the centre's first research project, the Beirdd Tywysogion, or Poetry of the Princes project, a 5-year project funded jointly by the University Grants Committee and the University of Wales. The aim was to create a comprehensive edition of all the poetry associated with the courts of the Welsh princes between the beginning of the 12th and the end of the 13th centuries. Over 30,000 lines of very linguistically challenging poetry, which had been rather neglected in the past, largely because of their difficulty, but also because of their rather unappetizing themes of warfare, power, and violence. The few poems on the themes of love and nature that these poets had produced, on the other hand, had received much attention in the 20th century, skewing our views of these poets generally. Such poems were the exception and not the rule. So this project was really important for our understanding of the development of Welsh literature at the time. Well, when the project was launched on the 1st of October 1985, the census prided itself on its cutting-edge technology. Each of the 4 researchers were allocated a microcomputer to prepare their editions using a very basic word processing program, WordStar. The computers were Apricot F1s with a trackball instead of a mouse, and an infrared wireless keyboard, which was actually quite handy without the cables. To be honest, this was the first desktop computer I'd ever seen, and probably ever used as well. And that wasn't unusual. I wasn't unusual amongst my peers at the time. Once the researcher had finished their initial work in WordStar, the files were then converted to the more advanced ViewWriter scientific program and processed further on the centre's Apricot XI computer, which boasted a 20 megabyte hard disk, the state of the art at the time, and a reminder to us that there were apricots as well as blackberries, apples and oranges in the technological fruit bowl in the past. Well, at this stage, the work was carefully proofread by a professional proofreader, as well as by each member of the team, and a great emphasis was placed on correctness, accuracy, and consistency. Once the changes then had been made, the files were, from the perspective of the narrative at the time, as reflected in this early press release, ready to produce the final book. And they were sent on floppy disks to the University of Wales Press for immediate publication. The expectation was, to quote the press release, the volumes will be processed up to the point of printing by the Centre's secretary on her Apricot XI20 computer. But the narrative, of course, proved to be flawed. In retrospect, this was a rather naive plan devised at a time when desktop publishing, or DTP as it was called, was all the rage. Many academics were publishing their research independently, often through their local university printers, thus negating the need to publish through established academic presses. This was a rather bad time for publishing in general. And even our own institution produced some fantastic content at the time, but in a very amateurish way, like this wonderful introduction to the Medieval Codex by Daniel Hughes. Everything about it, from the actual text, apart from the actual text, is amateurish, from the text on the page to its binding. In fact, what we were doing, of course, on the Poets of the Princes project was not typesetting our work as such, but preparing our work in electronic files to be processed further by another agent, in our cases, the University of Wales Press. That is, of course, what almost everyone does today when submitting work for publication. But this was cutting edge at the time, in the mid-80s, and the fact that a typesetter would not need to input our work from a typewritten script or even a handwritten one meant that the production process could progress more swiftly. But the point is, our outputs were not camera ready. This fact became quickly apparent to us as a team, as we realised that our work would certainly need to be processed further in order to comply with the University of Wales Press's exacting and fully justified standards. This would entail professional typesetting, full compliance with the press's editorial guidelines, and as a result, further periods of proofreading for us, taking us away from fresh research on the poetry and setting us back in our timetable. The original expectation was that we would edit and publish most of the 7 volumes within the 5-year time frame. But in the end, only 1 volume came out in the period, and that was right at the very end of the 5th year. The remaining volumes would appear over the next 5 years. Well, I personally felt great frustration at the time. Checking and rechecking work is a laborious part of any committed researcher's work, but checking for a third party's errors when our own submitted text had already been so well checked felt to me like a waste of valuable time. The vision itself was exciting, but at the time we didn't have the proper technology or expertise in place to carry it out. In 1993, Professor Guy Griffith retired, and I was invited to lead a new project, the Beirdd Rechelwyr o Poetry of the Nobility Project. A team of 5 researchers was appointed, funded by the HRB and the University of Wales. And the aim this time was to edit hitherto unedited poetry composed between the end of the 13th century and the middle of the 16th. This was a huge body of work that would require a robust publication programme. And so the Poetry of the Nobility series, Cyfres Beirdd Rechelwyr, was born, which would eventually include 44 volumes and a further 3 loosely associated volumes as well. Well, I was determined this time to return to the initial vision of the first project and to make it work. It's made such good sense. I was also inspired by the fact that Andrew Hawke, my colleague at the University of Welsh Historical Dictionary of Welsh, had developed a groundbreaking way to computerize the dictionary, its editorial process, as well as its typesetting, saving the University of Wales hundreds of thousands of pounds, and that is no exaggeration, as well as making the dictionary staff's work much more efficient. Well, by 1993, the makers of ViewWriter had gone out of business, and so we all received a copy of a brand new program, Microsoft Word version 2.0a, a powerful word processing program that boasted the potential to produce finished pages for printing. And that was the start of a rather long and tempestuous relationship between myself and Microsoft Word. To be fair, it was and still is a word processing program and not a typesetting program as such. But in fact, it has proved completely adequate for my requirements over the years. Indeed, it is what I use to typeset my Geirfair Fleet volume, which was published by the University of Wales last year, pressed last year, from a camera-ready PDF file that I had provided them. For people who, like us, who want to use our time for research, rather than learning how to use complex typesetting programs such as Quack Express or InDesign, then works very well, although it has driven me up the wall at times with its rather clumsy and inflexible way of doing things. Well, once the volume had been typeset, my initial intention for the Poetry of the Nobility project was to produce a camera-ready copy that would be printed using the traditional offset litho method. The obvious disadvantage of that approach was that the final stage would have been very costly for such a small run of books, around 200 to 250. By luck, I happened to come across an article about a new method of printing books on demand at the time, using a Docutek machine, which was launched by Xerox in the early 90s. The Docutek was basically a sophisticated laser printer that printed books in black and white from digitized text, rather than from printing plates. As a result, the ink was particularly crisp and dark on the page. The setting up of a traditional litho printing job would have been quite costly, as it included photographing the original copy, making plates, putting them on the printing machine, inking, and so on. And the price per copy, therefore, of a litho printing 500 copies was much cheaper than the price per copy of litho printing 50 copies, say, because most of the price went to cover the setting up of the job. On the other hand, as there were hardly any costs to set up a job on a Docutek printer, the cost of producing each individual copy was more or less exactly the same. So for a short run, say, of 200 books, like we needed, the Docutek method was so much more economical. In 1993, there were only 5 companies in Britain that offered Docutek printing. And an early mistake that I made was to choose a company that knew next to nothing about book production, despite their boasting to the contrary. Their speciality proved to be producing advertising material for the American Express company. I had to explain everything in detail to them, the importance of consistent margins, the position of the text on the page, etc., etc. So after that painful experience, I was very careful to ensure that the companies I chose had expertise in book production and that I had actual evidence for that fact beyond their own claims. Well, as the years went by, more and more companies offered the Docutech or similar laser printer service, and the production price of the volumes gradually fell from around £800 per volume at the beginning, when we set £8 as the price for subscribers, down to around £4 per volume by 2015, depending, of course, on the number of pages. So apart from staff costs to produce them, the volumes more than paid for themselves over the years. Well, as I've noticed, one major advantage of having complete control over the publication process is being able to ensure that the editor's work was published fairly soon after it was completed, allowing them to move on to fresh research. This also proved especially useful when we were faced with one wave after another of demanding research assessments in the higher education sector, the dreaded RAE or later RAFs. It was of great importance for these assessments that staff members' contribution were published by a specific date in order to be counted. But navigating the bureaucratic hoops of some academic presses, as well as the lengthy editorial and proofreading process, often resulted in quite a delay from the initial point of submission to final publication of a book. And some publications would not make it on time, causing great stress to the researchers themselves, as well as to their institutions. As well as swiftness of production, it was of vital importance that our books were well produced, attractive to read, and that they felt professional. We adapted Times New Roman to create a dedicated font for the project, which we called Times Cymraeg, or Welsh Times, and this included all the special symbols or characters that we needed to convey Middle Welsh orthography. This, of course, was before it was possible to choose these letters from the Unicode character map, as we do today. While choosing font size, leading, that is the space between lines, types of headings, running heads, footnotes, and all those things can be quite difficult. But getting this right is what makes a book look professional, rather than an amateur attempt at typesetting. As one who has had no formal training in typography, I have no shame in admitting that the most effective way I have found in getting an effective design for a book is to copy a professionally produced volume which works well, rather than relying on my own ideas of what looks good. So I followed the University of Wales's typographical conventions, modelling the Poetry of the Nobility series on their Poetry of the Princes series. Well, after planning the volumes in detail, making decisions about page size, margins, types of headings, and so on, I created a template within Word that included a set of styles. This proved a very effective way of maintaining consistency over the team's work. Each type of paragraph, be it a note, footnote, line of poetry, or normal prose, was allocated a style, which determined the typeface, its size, the leading, that is the spaces between lines, tabs, indents, and so on, of that paragraph. For example, the style I named testing or text ensured that the position of the poems and their line indents was consistent throughout the whole series. Well, once a member of the team had completed their work, the files would come to me then to prepare the final version. I had a special template containing exactly the same styles as the researchers had, but with different settings. So the page size would automatically be changed from A4 to the Royal Octavo size. The font would be reduced automatically from 12 points to 10. and similarly with all the other settings. And then at this point, I would add running heads, check for widows and orphans, and all those other aspects that contribute to the professional feel of the printed page. Well, as well as ensuring that the books looked professional, it was important too that they were reviewed independently of the team to make sure that the research itself was of the highest standard. At this point, I would then share the proofs with our editorial board and then pass their comments on to the relevant team member who had the last word. The editorial board was one of the strengths of the series and included experienced textual editors and linguists, all very willing to give their time freely to share their advice and comments. Personally, I learned a great deal about the poetry from them and how to edit it by dealing with the comments and discussing them with the individual editors. So in a way, this was training for me in the field. Well, once everything had been checked, all the cross-references done and that sort of thing, I would prepare the final file for the printers, as well as the artwork for the cover, which was fairly simple. By this point, I would know how many pages would be in the volume, and I had a formula to work out the width of the spine. Before PDF became the standard, the industry standard in the early 2000s, I would save the files as PostScript files using the Adobe Acrobat distiller. These would produce rather large files that had to be sent in the post initially, as they were too large for email. But before long, it was possible to send large files over the internet, which made things much easier and safer as well. Well, our method proved very successful for us. We produced 44 books over the 20 years. These are some of them. And in one particular year, faced with a looming REF exercise, we managed to produce 5 books, some of them being the works of colleagues in other universities in Wales, thus fulfilling one of the initial goals of our research centre, namely to support the work of colleagues in other institutions. One factor that should be borne in mind before venturing on self-publishing is the ability to market the final product. The fact that we had a secure base of around 150 subscribers meant that we didn't really have to make a great effort to market our books. But if we had to do that, I think it would have been a weakness in our plan. Well, to conclude, in explaining to you the background to our decision to undertake self-publishing at our centre, I realise that I've spent much of my time explaining how things were in the 90s. But in a way, the boom in desktop publishing at that time and the new opportunities it offered academics to see their work appear swiftly in print closely mirrors the huge explosion of possibilities around print on demand today through companies such as Amazon and Lightning Resource, just to name just 2. Academic self-publishing certainly offers great opportunities as regards saving money and time, as well as giving us control over the production process, or some control, in fact. But our concerns should be the same now as they were in the past. The high standard of content, which goes without saying, but also the professionalism of the layout and format and production in general. For example, it's much too easy for us to be tempted by the huge array of fonts available these days. But an academic publication is not an outlet for us to demonstrate our individual characters or quirkiness. The format needs to be clear, consistent, without drawing any attention to itself and away from the actual research presented. And as I previously mentioned, the best way to choose an effective format is to copy that of a well-produced book by an established press. This is perhaps the one instance where I would recommend plagiarising. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Diolch. Yeah, plagiarism is always a controversial topic, but what struck me from that, and we'll come back to this and hopefully the question and answer at the end, is how many of those themes are constant? How many of those themes of professional appearance, of the difficulty in control of versions, of print, of paper, they speak across the years, and they've been very successful in producing a series. So from Anne's, lingerie sort of account of how it has been done and how these things continue to be, some things remain the same, into a slightly different, somewhat smaller scale, perhaps, account of more recent work, explicitly set up for the digital age, and some of the challenges involved in that from Daniel Reed. So, Daniel, when you're ready, over to you.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yeah, good evening, everyone. Yeah, so just I'll go right from the top again. I'm Daniel Reed. I'm the Public Engagement Manager and Research Fellow at the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History, which is a research centre with the primary aim of promoting historic links between Oxford Brookes University and the Methodist Church through archives, through artworks, publications, and research. Or at least it was, because this talk comes at a rather strange time, because the centre actually closes for good next week. So most of my time lately has been spent in boxing, labelling and barcoding our historic collections in preparation for deep storage and ultimately a future elsewhere. So this is something of a much needed break from scurrying around a campus, emptying cupboards. And that makes this the last outreach event I'll be participating under my current aegis. And really, I feel like all this is building up to an excuse for not having a fancy PowerPoint like Ann does, that Ann has just shared with us, because I've been rather busy. But nevertheless, I'm hopeful that I can share something of our recent experiences today. And the outgoing staff of the centre, myself included, are rightly proud of the many projects and initiatives that we've pursued over the past several years. And for that reason, I'm grateful to Adam for his invitation to speak alongside Anne today about one of those projects, which takes its name from our acronym OCMCH Publications, the Centre's self-publishing venture, which I've coordinated since the release of our first title in 2020. Now, what I intend to share this evening is a whistle-stop tour of our experiences in self-publishing and both the opportunities and drawbacks of the approach we've taken. I think throughout you'll hear some echoes of Anne's experience that we've just heard, although it might be rather more anecdotal. And I thought I'd just reflect briefly on what I've just heard. I thought it was fascinating to hear, Anne, how you confronted certain challenges, adapted as you've gone, and whereas it makes me feel rather further back, despite being maybe more having a more advanced technological starting point. It's a useful reminder that there are plenty of people out there that I can learn from, especially people who have been there and done that. So even though the centre for which I currently work is closing soon, I'm hopeful I imagine I'll still be muddying the waters of academic self-publishing in the years to come. Okay, so at the centre, we first started thinking about self-publishing as a way of reaching new audiences about 5 or 6 years ago. This was at least in part driven as a response to our shared experiences in the realm of academic publishing. Not wishing to point any fingers or name any names, but there were and are aspects of traditional academic publishing that we believed as a group acted as a blockage to the dissemination of certain kinds of work. Familiar difficulties, and again echoes of Anne's presentation, include the long gestation periods for many book projects from the point of submission through review, design, even entering into a congested series of books. It can take years, as we know, for some works to appear. There also seems to be a disincentive to certain types of publication, either by genre or perhaps the notions of scholarly exactness, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure. And of course, cost. that always looms large. Many great books these days come with an eye-watering 3-figure retail price, which realistically limit their customer base to a small clutch of research libraries, and sales, I say confidently with no actual figures to hand, I imagine rather in the dozens than the hundreds. To be clear, what I'm hoping to present this evening is not to say that traditional academic publishing is no longer fit for purpose, or that self-publishing is a like-for-like alternative to it. But the opportunities afforded by different kinds of publishing ventures can be a way of creating additional space for disseminating work in our field. Now, the self-publishing landscape is rapidly expanding, and the potential for creating your own books, quality books that is greater than ever. I have to admit that when I worked in an archive and local studies service some 15 years ago, the idea of a self-published title was a pretty fearful thing, usually recognizable by idiosyncratic formatting and a pixelated front cover. Things do seem to have come along since then. But to be absolutely frank, at the centre, we didn't spend a great deal of time exploring all the possible options. A historian and friend of ours had self-published works through Kindle Direct Publishing, or KDP, a branch of Amazon, for several years, and he became, in this process, our mentor and inductee to the first steps in releasing our own books. His guidance was invaluable in those early days, and the examples from his work provided a handy how-to, and occasionally how not to, guide to self-publishing with KDP. Now, this coincided with the beginnings of the COVID pandemic, and getting to grips with self-publishing became a project I was able to pursue during lockdown. It neatly fit into our workflows during a difficult time when we were looking to maximize and build on the centre's digital resources in order to keep up with our users. Now, I'll move on to practicalities now. A point I'd really like to emphasize at this stage, and I noticed that Anne started with this, is that despite the centre's various online resources, no member of our staff, myself included, have any particular digital expertise or training, or in publishing, aside from what we've learned on the job. Relatable to many more of you, I'm sure. So the relative ease of use of our chosen software has been an important factor for us. It's also, in my experience, been really easy to get started with KDP if, and this is a very big if, you're able to tether your account to a named individual cardholder for income and outgoings. This appears to reflect KDP's primary user base for self-representing authors. I recognize that this step might be less than straightforward for many institutions, particularly within larger bodies such as within, say, a university. So when it comes to the design elements of our books, my starting point has always been, again, echoing Anne, an understanding of what an academic work should look like. And I assume most, if not all of us here today, through long exposure, are familiar with the usual conventions. And this is something I sought to emulate with the centre's titles. This includes, illustrations and all the usual apparatus like bibliographies, indexes, etc., etc. It's amazing how far establishing a rigorous house style, again, we've heard a bit about this, and ensuring contributors stick to it, can take you towards producing a book that, in terms of its interior, looks much like any other text-based academic work. And I've made a note here, actually, yeah, we also use templates as well that we can port over to new volumes. So those line spacing, guttering, all the same, remains consistent. Some aspects of the house style we've developed have been rather more accidental than anything else. It was actually the editors of our first book who decided they'd like to use a particular font, Palatino Linotype, if anyone is interested to know. We found it rather smart and legible, so we've now stuck with it through all of our titles. So this is something of a hallmark of the books. With every book that we produce, there's been a learning opportunity for ironing out quirks when preparing that camera-ready manuscript for publication, whether that be line spacing, depths of gutters, placement of headers and footers. There's always something. Every time there's something else which you've got to get your head around and learn how to hopefully avoid as a pitfall for the next time. I made a note here that whereas I went through about 60 digital proofs of our first book, trying to iron all these things out for a variety of reasons, I can now typically settle a final manuscript in fewer than 10, and I'm always trying to bring that bring that number down. So another important design element are the covers, and I do have a couple of examples of these are sort of what our books look like. It probably is coming through to you a little bit fuzzy there, or maybe back to front, I don't know. And I think with cover design, this is where KDP is rather limited. I think it's important to acknowledge that. The inbuilt cover design suite is at best brittle, with a narrow choice of fonts available and few options for editing different design elements. It's actually the only part of the edit suite that's sort of a built-in function. Everything else is about uploading, camera-ready manuscripts. So not wishing to involve ourselves in the more advanced business of designing wraparound covers, which maybe in future I will have to talk to you, Anne, how you do that. We simply stuck to adopting this, very straightforward white. All our titles are white with usually a colorful image on the front and simple black and white blurb on the back. Clean, I hope, but straightforward. The sole concession in this approach, I tend to think, is the inability to put a logo on the spine, actually. And I think this is one of the biggest tells that your book is produced using self-publishing software. And if there's any one thing that makes me want to grapple with with creating more advanced covers, that's probably it. But once both the interior and the covers of the book are settled, it's possible to order proof copies from KDP, so you can check that all the elements of the book appear as you intended. KDP's software will occasionally sort of throw formatting elements out of alignment if there are any bugs in the original manuscript. Sometimes you just don't know until it comes through from the printer. And you can never be sure exactly how those covers will look until you see them in person. Will the colors be quite right? I'm not sure. You've got to see the finished thing, or the finished proof copy at least. So once I've okayed the proofs, it's time to make the book available to purchase online. When it comes to pricing the centre's books, every title that we have retails at between £4.99 and £13.99, depending on the printing costs. They're all weighted against the printing cost per unit. And these will be higher, say, if the book has more pages, if you choose full color options, everything you can imagine, really. The higher price banding also includes titles we offer in hardback, which is an option offered by KDP and really quite straightforward to implement, to have a title in both paperback and hardback. You can do the same with an e version as well, but that's been quite complicated, so I've avoided it. It's just time I couldn't afford to sink into it. But again, depending on the printing costs, and I can share this with you, we typically make between 50p and £3 on every copy sold. And these funds are reinvested directly back into our KDP account and used to print our next title. So it's a sort of, well, I would love to say it's been self-supporting. We've never quite reached that point. We have other funds within the centre which we channel in. But my hope always would be that we get to the point of breaking even. We're only ever just off. Not that making money has ever been part of our objectives, because we would not have fulfilled those terms, that's for sure. But we have been grateful, I should say, along the way to the authors who have worked with us have agreed to a person to sort of waive any royalties or anything like that, so that all monies raised can be reinvested in our publications venture, which has been a great boost to it. So in terms of promotion, and again, we've heard a bit about this, for every new title, we make use of the centre's established networks. We promote the titles on social media, send out to a mailing list, make sure that each of the libraries within Oxford Brookes University have a copy, and send notices out to any other relevant circulars. We also typically send out a few review copies so that discussion enters that academic sphere and that notice of these books gets to the people who will be most interested in them. So really, beyond just these practicalities of working with KDP, which I'm sure we could get into the minutiae of, and I'm sure perhaps if anyone else has any experience here, I could learn just as much from them as you could learn from me today. But what I really wanted to emphasize are the opportunities that self-publishing has brought to us in terms of outreach, engagement, and supporting research. And I want to illustrate this by giving some specific examples from the 11 titles that we've made available since 2020. 3 of those books are collections of essays or proceedings of research events held either by the centre or affiliate bodies. And as with all our books, we're able to produce these collections relatively quickly, say within 6 months of the event. We encouraged authors to submit their contributions in whatever state they felt fit. Like with research papers, self-publishing these collections allowed us to welcome pieces that were works in progress, or perhaps only a smaller part of a larger study. They could be a testing ground for ideas, while still conforming to the in-house style that we have. We really wanted to give authors quite an open remit. That's the advantage of keeping all of this in-house. These collections as well, they weren't just an afterthought either to these events. We soon began to think of the potential for publishing in this way as a core part of our event planning as well. You know, it's not just responsive. For instance, in 2022, we were contacted by a pair of postgraduate students at the University of Essex regarding a day conference on Methodist history that they were planning. And we were able to, through our self-publishing venture, to make the offer to produce a small volume based on the papers heard that day. I like to think that this represented a feather in the cap for a relatively small event, and it also gave the organisers their first experience of editing their own volume. The centre was similarly responsive when in the same year, the Methodist Insurance Company contacted us about helping them to mark their 150th anniversary. Now, this was a funded heritage project, and one of our research fellows was commissioned to write a new history of Methodist insurance, which we subsequently published. Print on demand made it much more feasible to manage the order of 50 copies that were to be distributed among current and former employees of the company. That was part of the project. This, yeah, as I said, this is one of the, that was one of the core outputs of the project, I should say, and it was undoubtedly made, more possible by self-publishing. I don't think we could have involved ourselves to the degree we did without that. I'm also aware that other titles by the centre might not have easily found a publisher elsewhere. These include a pair of extensive bibliographies of historic Methodist publications, a personal account of local ministerial training in Oxfordshire, and a previously unpublished manuscript history by a departed colleague. Each of these projects had their quirks that might have made them undesirable to more traditional publishers, either in scope, format, or in the last example, because the manuscript was actually unfinished. But these books all, in our opinion, had considerable merit, and we were proud to provide them with an outlet through ICMCH publications. So, beginning to wrap up, self-publishing through KDP has really revolutionized how the centre looked at disseminating scholarship. It's not without its drawbacks. As I mentioned, the financial requirements might not suit certain institutions, and the cover design software is brittle and limited. And I've deliberately left this point until last in order to address it directly. At the centre, we are aware of the ethical considerations of dealing with KDP and Amazon, and are aware that this was a deliberate choice we made for primarily practical reasons. We have encountered 2 or 3 instances where prospective buyers have inquired whether the books are available to purchase elsewhere because they prefer not to buy through Amazon. In those cases, we've simply been upfront about the nature of self-publishing through KDP so that they can make an informed choice. So I'll emphasize now, my presentation today has not been a sales pitch for KDP, but rather an occasion to share the centre's experience of self-publishing and the various opportunities it's afforded us with a relatively modest financial investment and with only a small team behind it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Daniel. There's a lot in that, and a lot of commonality, as you said, with Ann's conversation. I think what I'm going to offer the opportunity to is bear in mind that we're recording this. So if you're not comfortable appearing on camera and you've got any specific questions, please put them in the chat. There's been there's been a couple already. One about ISBNs. Where do you get an ISBN? Well, very conveniently, Des Atkinson has put an answer in, which is from NielsenISBNstore.com. Any other sort of options for that, or is it just, or are they got a monopoly on it? Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, all I was going to say is, and perhaps I'm not sure if this is the in terms of sort of longevity and people who know more about publishing, I'm not sure it's the best option, but KDP does offer to issue an ISBN. It can generate an ISBN for you. I'm not sure how that will work in terms of institutional association. I think it's curiously on Amazon that it identifies the work as independently published. I think, and I'm sure any number of people here could tell me the drawbacks of doing that, but that's the option we've gone for. I think I always fall back on the idea is that I'm not running a publishing house. I'm trying to disseminate research in an accessible, if not unflawed way.
And what are the advantages of having an ISBN, in case anyone's wondering? Because it's a thing that books have, but what's the advantages or disadvantages? What's the advantages of having them or disadvantages of not? And Anne, you can join in on this.
I'll be interested to hear Anne's experience of this.
Yeah, I think they're necessary for cataloguing and all sorts of things, for bookselling and everything. And quite often now as well, you need a barcode as well, to be, if they're going to be sold in shops, but they can be easily sourced as well online.
The answer is online somewhere.
Yeah. Can I just I mean, sorry to be cheeky, but I'm just curious to know how, you clearly sort of download it and then you sort of upload it to your document. Is it like essentially a JPEG or something that you put into your document? Is that how it works?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Very simple.
Thanks. Okay, cheers. Thank
you. Daniel, you didn't mention what sort of typesetting system you use. Are you Word users as well?
Microsoft Word all the way. Yeah, Microsoft Word. Like I said, it was really helpful to me to hear Anne talk about templates. Actually, we haven't got a disparate number of them. All I do really is use the previous publication. Sort of take a couple of sample pages that's got all the presets in terms of the margins and everything like that, which I know that KDP can digest at the dimensions that we use. So once I had that all figured out, I cling to it. I produce that in Word, generate a PDF, upload the PDF, and that's your camera ready manuscript.
And of course, you can, if you've got the budget for it or want to, you can pay people to do your typesetting for you. There are agency typesetters. There are. Question from Jodie Hawthorne: does anyone use Publisher instead of Word? Is it better if you've got? And it would be. I suppose it would be better if you've got lots of text boxes, because anyone who's used Word knows that tables and text boxes are, well, kryptonite, frankly. But that's a fair point. Does anyone has anyone actually in the room got any experience of using Publisher for this? Put something in the chat if you have, or raise your hand. Yeah,
I use Publisher to design the covers. That's all I'll say, simply because I can kind of move those, again, text boxes and visual elements around in a way that the KDP software just cannot. And actually what I do, if we're just getting a little bit techy, I produce it in Publisher, save it as a JPEG, then upload the whole front cover as a single image into the only trouble with that is you can't do the same for the back cover, so the fonts on the back are slightly different to the front, so I have to pick a font that's similar to what we use on the front, which is jarring to me, but it's one of the few elements that we have limited control over, and I haven't had any complaints about it. So
certainly from Joan in the chat, Adobe InDesign is certainly what the professionals use. Yes, but like anything Adobe, there's a big financial price tag attached to it, and learning curve using the software too, which is
I found Publisher is great for doing things like newsletters, where you want lots of pictures and captions, and you want to move things around, and it's great for that. And Word can be a bit sort of temperamental doing things like that, and you'll have pictures whizzing around or not staying where you put them and that sort of thing. So, but I wouldn't typeset a book with Publisher because I haven't had the experience. It might be better than Word, I'm not sure, but I've learned how to use Word and I've stuck to it. InDesign, I know, and Quark Express are supposed to be so much more powerful, but I haven't got the time to learn them. And I've had advice from people, who do use them consistently, and people like me without a technological background who follow a list of things to do because they don't understand the programs. They just, sort of. So I gather they're difficult. Daniel, have you had any experience of Quark Express or in design?
Absolutely not. We're in the same. I think at the centre we're in a similar position to you. And when I talk about our publishing venture, it's me doing it. You know, I copy edit every book and liaise with the editors and put it through. You know, so yes, our centre is only 4 people. I'm in charge of this bit, so everything has been about convenience, accessibility, you know, expedience, yeah, all those things. And you know, I'm a researcher. I'm not a publisher. So it's been a fascinating adventure to pursue this, and I'm really proud of what we've done. And you know, I do feel like we've made the books look as rigorous as they can do within the constraints available. But no, I haven't even been tempted to meddle with more advanced.
Same here.
Ruth.
I was just going to add that on the front cover front, I have a friend who is a graphic designer, and she actually swears by kind of free online software, by things like Canva, which provide you with these kind of, that there's some sort of preset thing, and then you can move things around, or you can start from scratch. And sometimes you have to pay for like a kind of upgrade, but often there's quite a lot that you can do online free if you're trying to do that thing that's a bit more kind of designy, and you've got lots of images and lots of different text that you want to move around, maybe at different angles or whatever. But I can see that for the kind of clean aesthetic, and I really like the way that, Anne, that you were talking about academic books are not the place to demonstrate your kind of quirkiness, but a way to cleanly and effectively communicate academic knowledge. Publisher and Word sound like a safer, potentially.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, and that professional, consistent approach as well. And I did like the point about, you know, find a template and stick to it. Don't try and copy something that you like the look of. That strikes me as very wise, because otherwise that you end up going down the road of fiddling with formatting and everything, which is fine if you're doing it in your own time. But if you're trying, the whole purpose is to get things out quickly and efficiently. That's maybe something you don't want to do. Are there any more questions? Any more questions at all, or any points that any sort of matters arising? Any thoughts? Yes, Dan.
Sorry, I just think about Canva there, Ruth. I've had limited experience. We have used Canva in the centre, especially to create sort of little graphics for social media and things like that, which it can be really helpful for. I just think that there is the trouble with Canva is things tend to look like they've been made on Canva. If you know what I mean, it's quite a recognizable graphic design style. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, and it probably, I can imagine, leads you down certain creative channels. So I'm not saying that our covers are scintillating, but I have sort of just done those, you know, by my own sense of what I think looks reasonably clean and attractive. And I just worry that, you know, I suppose if we're using Canva for this sort of thing, sort of maybe every cover would look similar, but in a certain recognizable way. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just suspicious of things.
I mean, how much does that actually matter? It's my sort of thought. But yeah, Ruth.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask, well, both Daniel and Anne, about like a really pragmatic question, and sorry if it feels a bit like airing dirty laundry as well, but about the very initial startup cost that you have to get these things printed before you then start getting the money back. And obviously, Anne, if you've got a subscriber model, that's slightly different. But just thinking about people who are thinking about doing this, what are they looking at to start that process off?
Shall I go first?
Yes,
please. Yeah.
Well, what I did was, you know, each time I published a volume, I sent the university rules dictated that I had to send out to 3 companies for quotations, and then so I got an idea how much a 300-page book would cost, and then I costed the series for subscribers £8 initially per volume. And that seems to work well, you know, and in general, the price came down over the years rather than going up, but the price of paper has gone up since COVID. So I'm not sure how that would compare if I was to cost a 300-page book today. But that's what we did. We worked out initially how much it would cost to print a volume, and then just set that as a price. And then they covered themselves. It obviously didn't cover the staff costs, but production-wise, they covered themselves. And
which I think sort of speaks to one of the questions we've had in the chat, which is you're buying printing in. You're not doing this at home. You're not using sort of a workplace printer. You're actually you're sending this to a copy to someone to get it printed.
Yes.
And is that printing binding service, or is that all part of the same thing, or is that
printing and binding and everything.
Sorry, I was just going to chip in. I mean, I suppose my answer to this sort of question is pretty straightforward, really. In terms of initial startup cost, there's no cost to begin work on KDP. I suppose you need to have money in the bank to produce. Well, what might you need in the first instance? You need to produce proof copies just to make sure you don't have to produce proof copies. You could just upload everything and cross your fingers and then see what happens when people start buying them. But no, we generally produce proof copies, which might cost £3, £4, £5. It's cheaper than the finished product, and then like I said, we've tended to try and issue review copies, provide author copies. So let's just call that maybe enough for 10 bought at a discounted rate. So actually £50, and you've probably got enough to start. The only trouble is in terms of becoming self-sufficient. Like I said, we never quite got there, or there've been periods where we got closed. KDP sort of issues royalties. I think it's on a 2-month reporting cycle. So you have to sort of wait for that to come back around. And naturally, if sales are healthy, and I know authors of other genres, I think, can do reasonably well out of this model. It's just bridging those gaps. Usually if we're waiting 2 months for just a few royalties to come in, we're already planning the next volume by that point. So we've just topped up the account from our own budget, but only a relatively small amount.
Some things in the chat about getting these things bound. I mean, there's different options on this. I know if you're asking a print shop to do something to print a run of books, the one thing I would say from experience is only print what you can sell. Because I've been a secretary of a record society, and I've seen the consequence of not doing that, which is a garage full of books gently festering. You do not want it to be your garage. You don't want it to be your money that's being eaten by mice, which is sort of a gentle way of putting it. But print on demand is also a thing, and KDP is one way of doing that. Lightning Source is quite a well-known way of doing that, and they have obviously a range of options for finish and for print and for covers and for binding, which vary, which obviously have different price points, and you can set these things up. I'll put a link to Lightning Source in the chat for anyone that's interested in exploring that. But that's something that's quite widely used by small publishers of varying, and by people publishing their own stuff. But again, that's more for producing a run of books to sell. I think you can set it up as a print on demand source. Print on demand is probably the way. Is a big. I think the biggest change between when Ann started, certainly, and today, because it wasn't really practical. You're not dealing with a physical process. It's now a digital process, which can be actually very helpful. Certainly, the British Association of Local Historians do various print-on-demand books. That's how all their stuff is done, which has some slightly odd results in that if they do a volume on websites for local historians, which sounds counterintuitive. That's just the thing that's the thing their members wanted, and it's quite possible that every copy of that book now produced is slightly different, because you can do that, because websites obviously change and they come and go. So that's another sort of point of flexibility, which my friend and colleague John Chandler mentioned some years ago. But it's print on demand is a thing, and that is perhaps if you don't want to have these books lying around, or you don't have any pressing need to have a stock of books, which is worth bearing in mind. That's an option worth exploring.
I've got no experience of print on demand, and I tended to have my books, sort of printed in experienced presses. Because it was important for me to have the binding and the stitching and everything. But of course you can choose that. I'm sure through lightning, so you can choose your bindings and everything.
I don't think you can have sewn bindings, but
You
you can have
can.
most other. I think you can have most other things.
But yeah, it was just important the books opened well, and you
Yeah,
did
yeah.
just sort of force them open and that sort of thing.
And and user experience of the finished item is important. There is a tension between getting the things out there,
Yeah,
I think, and having something that's genuinely nice to have. That's something that only you as producers can actually gainsay, I think.
Yeah.
Is that a fair comment?
It is a fair comment. Yeah, it's you have to decide what's best for your text, don't you? You know, production and everything, and how it layout and everything. Guided by the text and who's going to use it, and who you're marketing it to.
Yeah, Daniel.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to chip in there, and I don't know if it was completely clear in what I said, but our model is of course completely print on demand through Kindle Direct, so we don't keep any stock whatsoever of the books. There have been occasions where we've got a few, and I mean literally 5 or 10 for specific events, or just to give one instance, a museum we're connected with wanted to have a stock for their shop, so we put in a bulk order. But those are the only conditions in which we buy any amount in. It's once it whizzes off to the Amazon marketplace, that's it really. And in terms of the printing quality, I mean the paperbacks are we've seen these print on demand books. They are as you imagine. I think they seem relatively sturdy. The hardbacks are sort of curious. They have a slightly kind of laminated kind of feel to them. They're not up to those. I'm a bit of a bibliophile in my in the rest of my life, so I love a quality book. But there are occasional oddities. When we did the run of the Methodist insurance books, at least one of them came through as a sort of Franken copy with two volumes merged together about this thick. So I keep that in my sort of cabinet of curiosities. Now we could probably never duplicate that, never have it happen again. But clearly, in the automation of the process, strange things go on sometimes.
Yeah, and that's something to watch for. I mean, having said that, even quality academic presses and their printers can do strange things.
Yeah.
And one bit of advice I was given years ago was, when you get a new book, always check it has all the pages you're expecting to have in the order that you're expecting them to appear. And it's good advice. And there is at least one VCH volume, one VCH book that every copy will fall open in the same place, because those pages were not included in the original printing. But I'm not telling you which one it is. You're gonna have to go through the shelves and find it out for yourself. But that sort of thing is it's just good advice for buying this product. And if you're buying a run of books, that is a product, and it's just something to bear in mind, I think.
Yeah.
But the key point Anne made about doing what's right for your text is, I think, a really interesting one, a really important one. Here's a big one. Yes, from Stephen Buckley. Physical longevity of books produced due to costs of binding and paper. You compare to some books produced in the 70s during various oil crises and shocks. Now becoming browning, fragile paper if paperback and binding glue and dry brittle. How big I suppose there's two questions there. One is this question that Stephen asks, which is, can you plan for, as part of your production process, allow for reissue in future if you think that the market's there? And the other one is, how big a concern should longevity be? I think the second one, for me, the second one's imponderable, but I don't know if you have a particular view on it.
Yeah, we've certainly reprinted some of our volumes after the initial print run. Especially there was a volume of poetry by a Welsh poetess who wrote some quite sort of racy poems. That was very popular, especially with courses in universities. So we reprinted that 3 times. So we printed over 450 copies of that volume. So
yeah, that gives you a sense of how these sales. And the poet in question is Gweddil Mechain, in case you're wondering. Yes. It's always Gweddil Mechain. And if you haven't heard of Gweddil Mechain, well, I'll put a link in the chat and you can read about her at your leisure.
But as as I was saying, the prints per copy with the laser printers, sort of type printing is, there isn't any setup cost. So we could easily reprint 20 or 25 or 50 or whatever, and no much extra cost to the initial print run per copy.
There's a question about bookbinding and professional binding, which I suspect is so planning a small print run of less than about 25 copies, and looked into bookbinding, which seems very expensive. Well, it is. That's why. Particularly for short runs, it's not something that could be. It's a particular skill set and a market, which I think with all these things, the setup costs are basically the same.
Yeah.
And the difference between, say, Harry Potter and the sort of thing we're talking about is all the setup costs are recovered in the first, say, 100 books. But for us, 100 books might be the complete sales life of the book.
Yeah.
But that's a scaling thing. And that applies to processes, I think, too. It's one of the reasons academic books cost so much money.
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing local history. I'm doing history around Notting Hill. But yeah, I mean, I have looked at all these options, and I think having looked at them a bit, I think I'm just going with finding A and B printers outside London. A small print run. If I do sell whatever 25, I get another 25. So yeah, absolutely, just keeping it small. I happen to have 400 quid. It's essentially sunk costs, and I just get on with it. It's as simple as that.
That seems very sensible. So, are there any other points anyone wants to raise, or any final comments from Daniel or Anne? Because I'm acutely aware we're eating to people's evenings, and people want to go and have their tea. No? Okay. What I should say is that a recording of this session will be made available via the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community website event, and specifically the event archive. And we'll let you know, anyone who signed up to this, when that is, and we'll publicise it afterwards. Thank you, everybody, for sparing your evening, and thank you particularly to Daniel and Anne for talking to us about their experiences in such fascinating detail, and giving us some sense of the rationale behind academic self-publishing as a discipline, and the pros, cons, and pitfalls. That's been really enlightening for me, and hopefully for everyone who's been listening.